So what I'm going to talk about today is an incredibly complicated and divisive topic. And because it's so divisive, that's exactly why it's important that we talk about it. So I'm going to start by asking you to accept that this might be uncomfortable, it might even be difficult. And I guess my wish is for this to be the beginning of a conversation or of conversations. As my slide is given away, I'm going to talk about sex work. I'm going to start by echoing sex workers' organizations all over the world to say that I want to take a strong stance against exploitation, against violence, and against coercion. And I'm going to take an equally strong stance for sex workers' rights as human beings and as workers. So when we first started talking about me doing this work, or doing this talk, I thought that it was incredibly inappropriate for me to even consider coming here and talking because I don't have any experience in the sex trade. As an incredibly privileged person, overly educated, as a white Franco-Québécois settler, I thought, am I really going to be one of those disconnected academics that speaks as experts on sex work when sex workers are fully equipped to do it, and of course are the only experts on their own reality? So, but as you can see, I'm alone on stage today. So when we originally planned doing this talk, I was supposed to have a friend of mine who's also a sex worker come and speak with me, but it wasn't possible for my friend to come. So I reached out to other sex workers in the city to ask them if they would like to come, but none of them were willing to come to such a public forum to speak as sex workers. There's a lot of reasons why they couldn't come, but the main one is stigma. Outing yourself as a sex worker comes with a lot of risk. It's extremely dangerous. So just by saying that you're a sex worker, it can lead to you losing your job. It can end a lot of relationships in your life, and it can, more importantly, it can lead to you can become the target of violence, of harassment, and just general blind hatred. And that starts from the moment you say it, and it lasts for the rest of your life. So that's why I'm alone on stage today. I'm trained as a medical anthropologist. I'm doing a Ph.D. in community health sciences at U of M. I have had the immense honor of working with sex workers' organizations in different places in Canada, as well as abroad, and I work here with the Winnipeg Working Group for Sex Workers' Rights. I could tell you so many facts and numbers about sex work. But what I'd like you to remember throughout this talk is that whatever I have to say matters a lot less than what sex workers can say for themselves about the way they live, the decisions they make, to take care for themselves, but also for people around them. So to signify this, I asked for this chair to be placed in the middle of the stage because I wanted to really mark how problematic and how completely messed up it is that the most important people in this conversation can't be here because they don't feel safe, they don't feel comfortable coming here and speaking about their lives. So this chair is here to represent people in my life who are sex workers and who didn't feel comfortable speaking today. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of violence in the sex trade and there's a lot of coercion. And that relates directly to stigma. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you right away what my main point is today. I want to say that the same stigma that makes it difficult for people to come on this stage and speak, that same stigma harms sex workers, it endangers them, and it makes all of the harms that are associated with the sex trade a lot worse. So I did have my friend did send a recording that I'd like us to listen to.
My name is Elena, and I'm a sex worker. I really wanted to be up here today with Claudyne, though coming to a place where publicly declaring myself a sex worker was an option has been a long and difficult process. I've been doing various types of sex work for 14 years. In addition to doing sex work, I currently do global advocacy work for the rights of sex workers. I'm in a pretty privileged and safe place in life these days. But I still worry about stigma, and every time I speak publicly about my experiences, I have a sense of dread contemplating the possible long-term consequences of being visible. I know that what's out there can't be taken back. I worry about how many jobs and career paths are closed to me. I worry about my ability to travel to other countries. I worry about accessing healthcare, being dismissed if I have to interact with the police, or worse, experiencing police violence. I worry about harassment and people treating me poorly because they can't see my humanity. I worry about being perceived as unreliable or not credible because of negative stereotypes. I worry that if I experience violence or am killed, society won't care and the media will reduce me to my work. The first time I spoke publicly about being a sex worker felt like stepping off a cliff, and I'm lucky. I have partners who love me, a good job, a nice home, and a supportive community. And I'm no stranger to stigma. I've been out publicly as queer, trans, an atheist, and non-monogamous. But sex worker is the only identity where the consequences of being out make me afraid and still give me pause every time I speak.
As I said before, there's violence and there's coercion in the sex trade. And that happens in part and definitely is made worse because of stigma. And stigma happens because we all allow ourselves to consider sex workers as less deserving of safety, of a good life, and of dignity. We do that by the way what we assume about them, with the way we speak about them, and through the laws and the policies that we enact. Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman worked on stigma over 50 years ago, and he found that stigma creates devalued relationships between individuals because of an attribute of stereotypes or something about that person or behavior that causes them to be seen by people around them as being devalued, as being undesirable, rejected stereotype. Other people who've worked on stigma also speak about how it relates to social inequalities. So stigma comes with social inequalities, but it also feeds it and contributes to it. So it contributes to broader systems of oppression, such as colonization, classism, racism, or sexism, and the ways in which all of these interact together. Okay, so horse stigma is a word or a concept that describes the stigma that's particular to women who are considered to be sexually deviant, and sex workers are definitely part of that group. Horse stigma and stigma forces sex workers into the roles of victims or menace to society. So we consider them as victims when we think about them that, oh, someone else must be forcing her to do this, or when we think she was probably sexually abused as a child, independently of what the person says about their own life at that moment. We see them as a menace to society when we think that just by hanging out with them, somehow other people are going to become sex workers. Or when we think that it's impossible for them to have a long-term relationship, or that they're not good parents. We also see them as a menace to society when we see them as responsible for sexually transmitted infections, when we see them as vectors of disease. Because the fact is, while some sex workers are at higher risk of acquiring STIs, it doesn't correlate directly with sex work. It actually relates to a bunch of mitigating factors that are in between the two, and that create the risk and the harm. Those factors are closely related to being in the outdoor sex trade or working on the street. Stigma makes us think that people are incapable of making good decisions for themselves. We treat adults like they don't know what's good for them, and we completely devalue their words. That happens so often, and we always seem to be ready to believe the words of someone else talking about sex work as long as it makes us feel more comfortable. But don't believe me on that. Believe the words of sex workers' rights activist Amy Leibovich. I live in a world that either victimizes or vilifies me. As a sex worker, I'm told many things. I'm told how I should feel about my experience within sex work, how I should view my clients. I'm told I'm blinded by false consciousness and that my experiences are not representative of the majority of sex workers. No matter what those who speak for us want you to believe, there are no representative sex workers. We are not just one type of human being who all share the same experiences. Stigma has very real consequences on the lives and the well-being of sex workers. It also has consequences on their physical health, their mental health, emotional health, and sexual health. Stigma makes it more difficult to reach out for help because you never know what institution or who is going to turn on you if you say that you're a sex worker. Last year, there was a sex worker who broke up with her partner, and her partner decided afterwards to call social services on her, even though she had been a sex worker throughout the relationship. And even though her children were not aware of what she was doing or were in no way exposed to it, they were taken away from her, apprehended on that basis. Stigma, in general, and this is documented through research very carefully, is a very powerful barrier to accessing social services as well as health services, even the most basic ones. Someone explained it to me once by saying, no matter what amazing relationship you have with your healthcare provider, you never know what they're going to say if they know that you're a sex worker, or if you do anything that makes them think that you might be a sex worker. So stigma also goes through the words we use. Words are very powerful, and they carry so much weight with them. The words can represent the stigma that's associated with the sex trade, but it can also represent the resilience and the creativity of sex workers' rights activists. So words like prostitute, if you look at the etymology of the word, it's associated with a degrading act or a person of lesser value because she was associated with a degrading act. Words such as prostituted women, exploited women, or violence against women's bodies, those expressions are also problematic because they deny the experiences of sex workers who do not feel like they're exploited. They also diminish the experiences of people who actually live exploitation, because it dilutes their experiences in an ocean of different experiences and treats it all as the same. It also describes sex work as something that is done to them and not something that they're doing. So the word sex worker was coined by a sex workers' rights activist in the United States in the 1970s. It was chosen in a deliberate attempt to try to unite all sex workers of different genders as well as the different line of work, because it describes them as a group of workers, just like any other group that has a lot of issues. They have their own struggles. So sex work means the consensual exchange of sexual services for compensation between adults. Sex work is work. It doesn't refer to any moment when there's coercion, when there's violence, or when there's exploitation by a third party. Sex workers' rights have been organizing. Sex workers have been organizing for a very long time, but the movement of sex workers' rights really started sometime in the 70s, in part stemming from the broader women's rights movements as well as LGBTQ rights movements. Since then, they've been organizing. It served as a platform for people to organize, to fight for their rights and to live and work with dignity. There are sex workers' organizations all over Canada who both advocate for their rights and provide services to their peers. One of the biggest fights that has been fought by the sex workers' movements in Canada has been a legal one. As you may know, we have new prostitution laws in Canada. So in 2007, a group of 3 very courageous sex workers based in Ontario filed a challenge to the Ontario Superior Court on 3 of the sections of the law, which they argued made the lives of sex workers harder because it stopped them from working indoors as well as hiring people for their protection. In 2013, the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously struck down all the sections of the law that were being examined because they were proven to be endangering sex workers and going against their human rights as per the Charter of Rights and Liberties. In December of 2015, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Person Act was passed by the Conservative government as a response to the Bedford decision. The new laws closely resemble what is known as the Nordic model, which is a model that was established in many Northern European countries. It's a model that aims to end demand. So what they do is that it becomes illegal to buy sex, but not to sell it. They do this and they claim to protect sex workers through doing that. So the Canadian model, as they refer to it, is very similar to that, and is different from the laws that we had in the past, in that it doesn't target sex workers. It focuses mostly on clients and third parties. However, they reintroduces offenses around communication for the purpose of prostitution and advertisement, and thus it actually still targets sex workers. So in places where criminalization has been implemented, there's higher rates of sexual and physical violence that are reported against sex workers. There's also in places where asymmetrical criminalization, like what we have in Canada, where that has been implemented, sex workers report that there's more harassment by social services as well as by police. The model that we have in Canada contributes to a lack of safety for sex workers. What it does is that it forces them to work underground. They have to go to darker and more remote places to work, and that keeps them from using some of the safety strategies that they use, like working in pairs or having someone for protection. Because their clients are considered criminals, it's also, they have to rush interactions with them to meet them, and that makes it very difficult to screen for safety. Because, again, of the rushed interactions, it also makes it very difficult to negotiate safer sex practices such as condom use. And finally, it makes it very hard to work indoors, and working indoors is safer. If I can just indulge in some name dropping for a minute, I'm just going to tell you that organizations such as the UNAIDS, the WHO, the Lancet is the medical journal, and the Canadian Public Health Association, and more recently, just last month, Amnesty International, have all come out for decriminalization of sex work. And they do that to have better health outcomes for sex workers as well as increased safety. The laws that we have in Canada do not aim to protect sex workers. That was made very clear in the process in which the laws were passed, in which the sex workers' organizations were not adequately consulted. It was also made very clear and actually stated by Manitoba Senator Don Plett during the hearings. The laws that we have in Canada right now, they were based on stereotype, they reproduce stigma, and they treat sex workers like they're a public nuisance that needs to be removed from neighborhoods and from sight. They treat sex workers like they're victims who need to be saved and not heard or seen. I realize that not everyone might agree with what I'm saying today, and I'm sure you have very compelling reasons to do that. So this is at best, the preface for a conversation. But I know that we all agree that violence against sex workers is wrong, it's unacceptable, and that stigma is unacceptable. Sex workers are part of my community. They're important and valued people in my life, and I assure you that sex workers are part of your community, whether you realize it or not. So let's start treating them like what they are. They're our family members, they're our neighbors, or coworkers, or friends. And let's treat them like human beings who deserve to have their choices be recognized and who have the right to live with dignity and safety. So the most radical thing that you can do is probably to seek your information about sex work from sex workers, to listen to what they have to say, and to believe them. And so maybe if that happens, disconnected academics like me won't have to take up their time and space to speak. So I'm going to let Anlena have the last words.
As sex workers, we want you to listen to us. We don't need saving, and we don't need your pity. We know it would make our lives better and our work safer. We are capable and organized. We just need you to create space for our voices so we can advocate for ourselves without risking everything.